Thank you very much for joining us tonight for this really important webinar with Alanna Geary. I'd just like to begin by paying my respects to the First Nations people on the grounds on which we meet tonight all over the state. For me, it's the Turrbal and Yagara people. We pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and I would like to also acknowledge that I meet on stolen ground. So thank you very much for joining us, everybody. Tonight we're going to be hearing from Alanna Geary. So Alanna is the Chief Nursing and Midwifery Officer of Metro North Hospital and Health Service, which is Australia's largest hospital and health service. She's a Fellow of the Australian College of Nursing, Chair of the Workforce Sustainability Policy Charter Australian Nursing College of Nursing, a board member of the RBWH Foundation, the Chair of the RBWH Alumni, STARS Education and Research Alliance Board for Metro North Health. Alanna has professional oversight over approximately 9,000 nurses and midwives across Metro North. She's worked in healthcare as a nurse and a midwife for nearly 40 years, with the greatest proportion of that time in senior nursing and midwifery roles. Alanna is committed to ensuring that nurses and midwives are at the forefront of all clinical and healthcare matters and decision making. As the QNMU organiser for RBWH and previously Prince Charles, Redcliffe Community and Oral Health in Metro North, I've worked with Alanna for over 10 years. Although we obviously don't agree on everything, one thing we do both agree on is the workload concerns process. Alanna has always been supportive and active around workloads, and the QNMU has worked with her in an interest-based approach with many workload grievances, including a number of stage 4 workload grievances, many with excellent outcomes for nurses and midwives. So please welcome Alanna Geary. You're on mute, Alanna. I'll do some interpretive dance while Alanna gets her mute right.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yep.
But I don't think you can see my screen, can you? No. Okay, I'll just figure that out. If I lose you again, I'll try and come back. I have to confess to not being the most tech-savvy person on the face of the earth. So Aggie very kindly showed me what to do, and I've probably forgotten it. There we go. How's that? Okay. Welcome everybody, and Kim, thank you very much for your introduction. As Kim said, Kim and I have worked together in various capacities, Kim as organiser and of course me as the EDNMS Metro North and also the Director of Nursing at the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital for a number of years when the roles were combined. And Kim's right, we don't agree on everything, but we do agree that the patients that we care for are the most important thing, and the staff that look after those patients are right up there as well. So we do come from a very solid base, and I think that has stood us and the other organisers for the QNMU more broadly in really good stead. So we do honestly believe that we're singing from the same hymn sheet 95% of the time. It's only those few things that for whatever reason we can't agree. So I'm going to talk tonight about workload concerns, and I take on board that many of you are not necessarily in the public system, that there are people online that come from private, and I hope that there will be lessons and learnings in this presentation that everybody can use. And just by way of saying that, I am more than happy for people to contact me if there's anything that you hear that you want to question after the vidcast or after the webinar. You're more than welcome to either drop me an email, and my email is pretty straightforward, and I'm sure Kim would be happy to give it to you. It's just the normal Alanna Geary Health. Those of you that are in public the public system can find me on Outlook. It's not that hard to find. Just remember 2 N's, because if you only put 1 in, it bounces. So I'm going to talk about workload concerns, reporting, managing and moving forward. I'm not so much going to delve into the individual process of completing a form, because I think that you would have that in spades, and you will all have different mechanisms. Certainly in Queensland Health, we have the electronic version, and while I'm not a huge advocate of the electronic version, only because I think that there are some system issues that are probably letting us down a little bit, and I don't think that I would be alone in saying that. I'm sure that you people who are using the electronic forms, but I don't think it really matters what you use to report a workload concern. As long as you report it, that's what's important. So I'm going to move on to my presentation. And like Kim, I would also like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where our health services are located. I pay my respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, elders and valued persons past, present and future, and recognise the strength and the resilience that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their ancestors have displayed in laying strong foundations for the generations that follow. For it is through building a joint understanding of water, land and community that we work together to reduce inequities. And if there are any First Nations people online with us today, welcome. It's lovely to have you. So in essence, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is a workload issue. And essentially, if your ability to provide care to the appropriate high standard, and you as a professional nurse know what that high standard is compromised due to the amount of work that you have to perform, it's a workload issue. If you're unable to take breaks because of your workload, it's a workload issue. If you have a lack of available supplies, it's a workload issue. If you miss care because you're too busy, whatever that care might be, it might just be something as simple as cleaning somebody's teeth, but you don't have time to undertake the task, it's a workload issue. If you believe that as a professional, and I can't reiterate that enough, you are a profession, we are a profession, that your patients, residents, clients are waiting longer than would be considered reasonable to provide care, then it's a workload issue. And only you can make that judgment. I can't make that call for you. You are down at the clinical coalface, or you are the nurse unit manager of a unit. If you can't do this in a do what you have to do in a timely fashion, then your workload is too great. If you have to stay longer than your anticipated finishing time, and I'm not really talking here about requested overtime or those sorts of things, but if you were due to finish at 3 o'clock and you're still there at 5 o'clock, then it's a workload issue. If you can't finish what you need to finish in an 8-hour shift or 8.5 hour or a 12-hour shift even, then it's a workload issue. And there are many, many others. I've just listed a few, but you will know those. You must use your professional judgment. And sometimes if you're the most senior person on that shift, you might actually help some of your more junior staff. We do in Queensland at the moment have a very high graduate workforce. We've got more new grads in our system, and that goes right across the state, regardless of whether you're in, Metro North, Metro South, Townsville, which are, Gold Coast, which are big facilities. If you're in rural and remote, or you're in a private facilities, you need to use what you deem as appropriate professional judgment, and nobody can criticise you for that. Hold on. I told you I was technically challenged. So what do you do when you want to report a workload issue? Well, in the first instance, my advice is that you contact your line manager. In the after-hours space, that might be somebody who's running the organisation and might not be somebody actually in your clinical unit, but you need to contact your line manager. Very often, and you would find this as well, many issues can actually be resolved almost immediately. Staff are either found to assist, or there's a piece of equipment is sourced for you. Beds can be closed behind patients who are being discharged, or patients are moved out into another unit. There might be strategies that they can put into place immediately. At the moment, and certainly the way Queensland is from a healthcare responsibility, and I want to apologise, my dog is behind me grunting and groaning and rolling on the carpet. He's quite excited I'm home. So if you hear strange noises, it's not me or my husband, it's the dog. But that doesn't mean that you don't have a workload concern. even if it's been rectified, my personal belief, and certainly what I try to reiterate in Metro North, is that you should still fill out a workload concern form. And there are really good reasons for that. Even if the issue has been fixed immediately, which sometimes you're lucky enough to have it happen, you can get some relief from whatever that means, from whatever means it takes. But often there is no resolution immediately. But even if it has been rectified, I strongly advise you to still complete the workload concern. And the reason for that is information is collected for future reference. Is this something that is a one-off? And if it's a one-off, don't worry, it'll go and get parked in the one-off pile. But if it is a trend, if it is something that is happening regularly, if every week at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, you haven't got enough staff, then something needs to happen. So my strong advice is complete the workload concern form. Make sure your line manager is aware. Certainly if you're on an afternoon shift or a night shift and you have a workload concern through the night, just let your NUM know, even if you can't speak to her personally or him personally, then make sure that you drop them an email or send them a text or whatever means of communication. If you have a communications book in the ward, just drop, send a workload concern form. It just alerts them to the fact that it's there and they can action it appropriately if they can. Now, if they can't action it appropriately, and that might be quite possible as well, and certainly with staffing issues, and the state is in a little bit of a crisis. We are coming out of COVID, and we went to tier 0 today, which is terribly, terribly exciting. It really will make them aware that there is a concern and give them the opportunity to look at what's going to happen for the future. Is it going to happen for the rest of the roster? Is it just something that's going to be easily fixed? Is it something that they need to think about for their next budget cycle? Is it something that they need to think about when they're looking at the next BPF? Part of the service profile, the SWOT analysis. There's a whole host of ways to deal with workload concerns. So my advice is that you try as much as possible to let your line manager know. Workload issues are always a concern, and Kim and I were talking before we started this webinar, and in essence, you have a professional responsibility to make sure that your patients or our patients receive the best possible care. And I always think about, if it was my mother, my grandmother, or even me lying in that bed, what is the standard of care that I would expect? What would I want? And I would want someone to make sure that I had all of my medications, that my IV was running to time, that my antibiotics were received in a timely fashion, that I was, I had my back done, I was offered a shower, that I was toileted regularly. All of those things are really, really important. And just remember, escalating a workload concern is not a criticism of you, your manager, or your organisation. It is a very respectful way of advising and ensuring not only can this concern be rectified, if possible, but future issues can be preempted. So please don't think that, and if there are any people who are line managers online, and I'm sure there is, I did see a couple of names there that rang a bell, please don't think that it is a tool to get to you. It is not. It is absolutely your staff's way of telling you that there's a problem. And as I said, sometimes a problem is an easy fix, sometimes it's a little bit more difficult. And sometimes it's going to have to go all the way up the chain. And many of them do end up with me or the Director of Nursing, and we work together. And occasionally we do end up in a grievance situation with the QNMU. But even that, much as a grievance, and I know Kim and I talk about it all the time, there's a huge amount of work when you get to a grievance situation. But I have never had a grievance really that we haven't been able to put in some mitigation strategies around to make things better. Are we ever going to live in utopia? Probably not. And we are always going to have times when we can't get a staff member, where we can't find a piece of equipment, where there is no staff around, but we do need to make sure that it's identified. Just remember, your professional judgment is a valued and respected tool for the assessment of a situation. It is quite legitimate to put in a workload concern just based on your professional judgment. You are the caring professional at the bedside, or as the NUM of the unit, or even as the nursing director, and it is your responsibility to make sure that you alert people that you've got a problem. Making a notification is quite lawful. It's an entitlement under the award, and you should be respected for making a valid and considered notification. So you need to think about the words that you use and make sure that it is very objective and that you've given all of the information that you can so that the workload can be addressed. You don't want to say, and I'm going to use you, Kim. Kim was really lazy today. She sat at the desk. You're not going to say things like that in a workload concern form, but you can say that not every team member was pulling their weight and I felt that I was under stress, and there might be reasons for that as well. So my advice is be as objective as you possibly can when you're writing a workload concern, but give as much information as you can as well so that we can actually assess what the situation really was. And hopefully your line manager, whoever that may be, will come and talk to you about the workload concern as well, so that you know that they're aware of it, that you know that it's going to be actioned, and please, they need to understand, as do you, that it's not meant to be punitive or a slight or on their ability to manage and lead. Sometimes these things are beyond the control of absolutely everybody. And I just lost my screen. Apologies. If you're a line manager, my advice is when you get the workload concern, go and talk to the staff member or members. Sometimes they're written by more than one person, or one person has written them on behalf of a few people. That's absolutely fine. Seek some clarity where necessary and action appropriately. And if you need to, then escalate it. Either escalate it to the line manager beyond, and there's Dottie sitting on Kim's lap. Escalated it. Remember, if you think there is a real or potential impact on your ability to provide appropriate care for whatever reason, you have an obligation to report and document. And the organisation should be very respectful of the fact that you've reported a workload concern, because the reality is, if care is compromised and there is an adverse event, it is not probably the individual nurse who's going to be taken to the cleaners, it will be the organisation. So identifying that there's a workload concern very early enables the organisation to put in some mitigation strategies to make sure that it doesn't go on forever. So really, it's an opportunity to really encourage staff to complete the appropriate forms. At the time of the concern, I strongly advise you need to encourage staff to discuss the immediate issue. You need to work as a team. Remember, many heads are better than one, and often together on a shift, you can come up with a way of dealing with the workload, whatever that is. And sometimes just identifying it's a one-off will actually enable you to think about how you work your workload. What are you going to do today to help fix it today? Because sometimes throwing extra staff is not going to be an option just because there is no staff available. So what can you do to make sure that you can still provide appropriate care to the patients that you're looking after? So look at the allocation of the shift at the time. Look at models which will enable you to support each other and the team in the immediate time frame. Look at your lower priority activities and talk collectively about what that will look like. You all should have in your service profiles as part of the BPF those activities which you as a group have come up with that are not considered to be as important as others. Now, I'm very much of the opinion, and I know most of you will be as professionals, that all care is important. But there are some things like restocking, making sure that the next shift has got what they need. What I would advise is you do what you need to do to get through the shift and provide the appropriate care to the patients that you've got in front of you at that time. And seek additional staff, equipment, or whatever is required where able. And certainly, I think where a lot of this often falls down is in the after hours space when there isn't as many people around. Night duty is a classic example where, a couple of people ring in sick, and often you'll have people on the floor who aren't normally with you. So you really need to think about how you're going to manage that situation. Talk to your line manager as soon as possible. I mentioned that. And also, where you can, support your line manager by helping to identify potential solutions, because often they're not with you 24/7. Your NUMs would be working Monday to Friday from, probably 6 or 7 in the morning till most probably 4 or 5 in the afternoon. I often say that if I don't know that I could be a NUM in this day and age. In my day, I walked in at 7 and I walked out at 3:30, but I defy any nurse unit manager these days to be able to stick to the standard 8-hour shifts. So I'm sure that there will be ample opportunity for you to spend some time with them, talking to them about what potential solutions. Do you need additional staff, either regularly or at certain times, to support times of increased activity? And you might find, having worked as a surgical nurse many years ago, I know that afternoons were often really crappy. And they were crappy because patients were coming out of the operating theatres, and yet there weren't as many staff around. So think about the times that you actually need additional staff. Do you need additional equipment? Sometimes it's not a case of finding additional staff, but you need more, monitors or more thermometers or whatever. Do you need to look at your rostering and looking at some reallocation of either shifts or people that are on the floor at that time? And do you need to escalate to your service line or to the Director of Nursing and Midwifery, or even to your Executive Director of Nursing and Midwifery? In nursing, we are quite blessed in many ways because we do have lots of points of escalation. So my advice is use those to the best of your ability to get what you need to get done. One of the things that I often say is, do you need to look and review your BPF? The BPF is actually a working document. While from a finance perspective, it is a little bit locked in because we present our BPFs to our finance directors or our business managers. They allocate the funding and you're kind of allocated that. But if it's not working for whatever reason, the only way your business manager is going to know that there are problems is if you escalate, and then your NUM, your nursing director, your executive director of nursing actually has the tools to go to them and say, we know that we need extra staff on shift, and for the following reasons. Think about what are the drivers behind that. Is it increased activity? Is it increased acuity of your patients? What have you got actually lying in the beds? Sometimes you can have a full ward and be, as you know, and be relatively quiet because 50% of the ward are actually going home the next day. But you can have a full ward and be absolutely run off your feet. And we do have mandated legislated ratios in Queensland. We are a little bit blessed. But remember, your BPF is the overarching document. Not only is your ratio important, so if you're in a medical ward, 1:4, 1:4, 1:7, but you might have a very heavy medical ward where your BPF has overridden that and you're actually on a 1:3 ratio or 1:2 ratio. And that needs to be, you need to regularly reallocate some of that. Now, I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, but I could have 6 patients and Kim could have 2, and we still have a 1:4 ratio. That's because my 6 patients are going home tomorrow and are probably not too bad. But Kim's a really high acuity. She's got drips and she's got tubes coming out of every orifice that you can imagine. And you work together. So I think it's really important that we understand that BPF in Queensland overrides straight ratios. What are the things that maybe could be changed? I grew up in patient allocation, and I know that a lot of clinical units still use patient allocation, but maybe that isn't the right mechanism to manage the patients that you have. Maybe it is a team nursing model. Maybe it's a practice partnership model. Maybe it's a registered nurse and a couple of enrolled nurses working with 8 patients. Only you, as the professional registered nurse or enrolled nurse, can make that call. I can't make that call for you. You need to make it on the day, and you need to use the tools that are available to you to make those calls. And ultimately, do you need to review the models of care? How are you actually delivering care? Why are workload forms so important, and why do I encourage them? Look, workload forms do cause the NUM some work if it's a frontline nursing staff member who has put in the workload concern form. They do cause some work for the nursing director ultimately. And of course, they're presented at the Nursing and Midwifery Consultative Forums, but we are one of the, well, we are the only craft group, if you like, that actually has their own consultative forum. And I think we should utilise that to the best of its ability. Not only is that an opportunity to discuss the workload concern, but it's also an opportunity for, as a collective, to actually think about that workload concern. And often people who don't work in your unit will come up with an idea that might actually help you change what you do to make it better for you. So it gives the organisation not only the immediate issue, but also gives the organisation the trends. So if I'm working and I'm going to use, say, 2A at Prince Charles Hospital, if 2A are having problems consistently, then we know that we've got to, as an organisation, we need to sit down and think about what 2A needs and move in that direction. And that's then up to the Executive Director of Nursing, the Nursing Director, probably in consultation with the Executive Director of the facility, and the business and finance teams to think about what's the long-term strategy to deal with ongoing workloads. The workload concern form that you put in protects you, it protects your line manager, and it protects the organisation. You don't want to be hauled in front of APRA or have an OHO notification made to you because you were run off your feet, you didn't fill in a workload concern, nobody knew that you were busy, that you forgot X number of medications. I understand that you're busy, and sometimes filling in another form on shift can be a bit arduous, but even if you have to stay behind for 15 minutes to do it, my strong advice is that you do that, because you need to protect you. You need to protect your registration, and you'll protect that of your line manager because they can't deal with what they don't know. The organisation can't deal with what they don't know. And the last thing the organisation wants is to end up in the commission or in front of the CCC or even in a court of law because somebody is litigating against the fact that they didn't get the appropriate care. So you need to identify the issues. You need to talk about the strategies that you did right then and there to mitigate the risk. You need, obviously, the workload concern forms give you the ability to explore and not only the immediate actions, but future options. Please don't ever think that it's punitive. It's not meant to be punitive. I know that some people think that if they put in a workload concern, they're actually complaining about their manager. To my mind, a good manager will actually encourage workload reporting. And it's not meant to annoy them. You know, a lot of people think, oh, I don't want to annoy her by putting, or him by putting in a workload concern. That's not what it's there for. And to be perfectly honest, the line manager can put in workload concern forms as well. You know, in reality, I can put in a workload concern form if I think my workload's too great. Now, I think that's probably unlikely because I'm sure my chief executive would hand it back to me and said, fix it. And so she should. But in reality, the workload forms and the ability to complete a workload is actually to everyone's. I'm seeing a few questions coming up in the chat, but I might, if everyone's all right with that, I might come back to them. Is that reasonable, Kim and Aggie, if I come back to the chat questions?
I think that's a good idea, Alanna, at the end.
Yeah.
I'm answering some of them as we go.
Excellent. Thanks, Kim. Remember, workload concern forms, and ultimately the process protects you through a documentation pathway. So having it well documented really ensures that you're protected. It enables the line manager to understand the issue and work through how this can be fixed. And as I said, sometimes there isn't an immediate fix, sometimes there is. It provides trending and information to the organisation and enables them to understand the current and future anticipated workloads, because you will actually be able to, certainly some care you can actually think, well, tonight was absolutely horrendous and therefore tomorrow is going to be bad. And by putting in a workload concern form and escalating it immediately, it actually gives an opportunity to think about tomorrow and the next day and the day after if necessary. And that is the end of what I had actually presented, but I really wanted this to be a little bit more open and an opportunity to chat, because I realised that I'm coming very much from a public health perspective, and I'm aware that we do have people from the private sector. I noticed a few questions in the chat around BPF. Your BPF should be available and visible for all staff to see. You should have access to your BPF. You should know what your notional ratios are so that you can actually work towards that. And the other thing too is you need to be able to know when it's time to escalate and when it's not. So you must have your BPF. You must also, if you can, be present or at least contribute to your SWOT analysis. And that should be done yearly so that your line manager has an opportunity to actually think about what the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats are. I mean, if we'd been doing BPFs 33 months ago, which is what I'm informed we've been in COVID for, imagine what the BPFs would have looked like. We would have had a much more robust process to deal with COVID. Now, no one could have known what was going to happen, and all we could do was deal with the here and now, and we've all lived through what that dream or nightmare was. But our BPFs would have looked very, very different had we had an opportunity to base our BPFs on what we've anticipated would happen. But we do have an opportunity now. I mean, if you think about what's happened in the last nearly 3 years, we know that we have got, certainly in the public system, and I'm sure private is much the same, we have got behind in a lot of our planned care. So a lot of our elective surgery has been held off because of COVID, certainly not the more serious or the category 1 and 2 patients, but many of our 3s, 4s and 5s have been put off. So we can preempt that the next couple of years are really going to be, we are going to be in a bit of catch-up mode. So we can almost base, certainly if you're working in an area where there is planned care, and I talk about surgery, certainly gastroenterology departments, anything like that where you've got wait lists, there will be an opportunity to actually look at that and base how you plan your workforce for the future. So I'm just going to open it up to questions, and I'm happy to either take them in the chat or people can talk to me if they want to. It'd be nice if we could talk, but I'm aware that everyone's bandwidth mightn't support it. Kim, did you want to say anything more or ask me anything from my perspective?
Thanks, Alanna. I was going to touch on the fact, and you touched on it briefly, around how valuable the workload forms, particularly when there is a trend, and you might not know there's a trend, but unbeknownst to you, like you said, every Wednesday there might be an issue and it's because it's Caesar Day or something. How valuable that can be for managers as the powerful evidence when they go into those negotiations with their business managers and when they're formulating business cases to get more staff, how they're quite pivotal.
Absolutely. I mean, I find, and I'll be honest, I hate writing business cases because they are quite long, and I'm not sure what they're like in the private sector, having never worked there, or certainly not at this level. But in the public sector, there is so many subheadings to complete. They can be quite difficult. But to be perfectly honest, if you're writing a business case and you've got information and data, it's far more powerful than just saying, anecdotally, I think that we're getting busier. If you can say that every Wednesday we know that we've got 12 Caesars booked, or 6 big head and neck surgeries coming in, or the gastro list is longer than ever, or if you're in cardiothoracic or something and you know that you're going to have some difficulties on Thursdays, it's really, really important that you provide that information so that your line manager can actually put the data together. As Kim said, your one-off may not trigger anything in your brain because you only see what you can see in front of you. But the line manager will say, oh, hang on, I've had this 3 Wednesdays in a row, or 6 Wednesdays in a row, or this has been going on all year. It really gives them not ammunition, and when I say ammunition, that sounds like it's a bit negative, but it gives you the ability to prove that what you're saying is correct. The workload concern form has triggered that. We use data all the time. We use sick leave data. We use, agency data. We use overtime data. If you can say that as well as using X amount of overtime and X amount of agency, plus I've got 7 workload concerns all pertaining to the same thing on Wednesday afternoons, it actually gives you a really solid base.
Is it just me, Aggie, or is Alanna frozen?
I can't hear her either. I was just messaging her if it's just me or...
Okay.
No, she's frozen, Kim.
She's frozen. There's a few of us that can't hear her yet.
So just while we're getting Alanna back online, I might fill in the silence, not with interpretive dance this time.
We wait to see that, Kim.
One thing I was going to mention as well is the skill mix, how important it is to report skill mix. You may have enough staff, but the skill mix, and Alanna referred to the fact that we have so many grads on board at the moment. It's really important that we actually report that. That is not a complaint against their inexperience. It's an alert to say, hey, you're rostering too many grads on shift. I had an episode in the last week where half the staff on a shift were grads. It was emergent. It was, you know, a couple of people were doing filling in for emergent leave, but we don't want 50% of our staff to be grads, and that's something that's really important to report so that we don't start getting that creep.
Kim, it's Janelle here. Can I just say something to that?
Sure.
I firmly impress on my clinical nurses and my team leaders all the time, and this is down to you and your anecdotal stories from coroner's reports. But if you've got a sick patient, you're documenting in the chart, you know, your challenges to some degree. But when you're the team leader and you've got enormous pressure on you with people screaming at you to get patients out, get patients in, you know, move patients to other wards, plus you're dealing with all of the clinical emergencies at the time, you're not documenting anywhere what you're doing. It's, you know, it's usually just dealing with every crisis as it arises. And I try to impress on the team leaders in our ward that a workload report is your way of reporting that you didn't feel safe.
Yep.
And more than anything, if you're not going home and diarising it or putting it in a chart somewhere or recording it somewhere, it's your way of protecting yourself. And recently, just very recently, we had a clinical incident where a patient arrived from the ED at 11 o'clock. She clearly needed a special. It wasn't handed over that she needed a special. She was ripping a telemetry off, ripping her clothes off, trying to get out of bed. Within an hour of her arriving, we asked, well, the staff on the shift had asked for a special. They was unable to be provided. Within an hour and a half of her arriving to the ward, she fell out of bed, hit her head, ended up with subarachnoid and subdural hematoma, and consequently passed days later. But the workload report had gone in already by this time, like we didn't know that was going to happen. I just feel like it's really important that team leaders and clinical nurses have somewhere to report the overall shift, not what is just happening with individual patients.
And you touch on an important thing, Janelle, in that it's also a professional responsibility to report workloads because it protects you professionally. It doesn't absolve you completely, but it does move some of the liability to your employer. If you've reported a workload issue, they have not addressed it. At least if you do end up in a court of law, you can say, I reported it, they did nothing. Well, and I'm not saying that they'll do nothing, but, you know, it just gives you that professional protection as well.
People tried. It wasn't like people didn't try, but there just was no. But that workload report became part of the HEAPS review.
Yeah, and it'll be part of the coroner's inquest as well.
Yeah.
So they're very vital. I see we have Alanna back. Welcome back, Alanna.
Oh, I am so sorry. My computer decided to shut down and restart halfway through, so I apologise.
You're lucky you didn't want to update as well.
No, thank God. I was blaming my husband while it was doing it. So were there any other questions? I heard Janelle talking. And I don't disagree with what she said, Janelle, at all.
Another question that's been coming up is for the grade 7s and above. Do you support them using the Workload, the electronic form, Alanna, or do you prefer them to escalate in a different way?
Look, I don't have a problem one way or the other. I don't think it matters how you escalate, just as long as you do escalate. My advice would be, if you don't use the electronic form for whatever reason, and that's your decision, that you just make sure that you write yourself a file note. I think sometimes I'm a bit of a queen of file notes. I keep them all the time, sometimes even about conversations that you might regard later as a bit insignificant, and you might choose to ditch it in 12 months' time because it really didn't eventuate. But my advice is, if you don't fill in the electronic one, which automatically gives you an electronic record, and you decide to just talk to your line manager, just write a file note that, on this date at this time, I spoke to, Kim Ramsdale about this workload, and these were the actions that we decided together, or whatever the outcome of that conversation was. I think it just protects you a little bit. It also, as I get older, I think my memory is fading. I will forget conversations if I don't have some sort of record. It doesn't have to be exhaustive, just to make sure that it prompts you. But to be perfectly honest, I have been asked to provide file notes, to the Commission or to other areas, not necessarily about workloads, about some of the other matters, and they've been really handy. Or you're asked a question a couple of years later about something that you did, and I defy anybody to remember what they did on this date 2 years ago. We live very busy lives, professionally and personally, so it's easy to forget. So I do like the idea of having an electronic record. As I said, I think in public health anyway, the electronic workload reporting is a little bit problematic, and it's all the glitches haven't quite yet been ironed out. Oh
dear, I think we're losing Alanna again. There's gremlins in the whole system today, I've been finding. I'll just answer Trish's question in the chat, where she's saying, can we put workload forms in for indirect workload concerns such as the CSD department? Absolutely, Trish. The workload does not have to be related to direct care. It's related to any of your workload at all. And we have had a few escalations of workloads in CSD departments that we've managed to resolve, simply because management just didn't realise what was going on. And once they've been informed, usually they will come to the table and try and solve it. I think we have Alanna back again. And we have a question from Dorothy. Alanna. Go, Dorothy.
Hey guys, I just would like to say I work as an after-hours manager in one of the hospitals in Brisbane, and I can really rely to some of the workloads, and, specifically after hours, because there is a lot of staffing issues and deficits literally since COVID. And I always tell my nurses to put their workloads in when, it's 11 o'clock at night or midnight. And as you mentioned, or somebody mentioned, there is a confused patient who comes up to the ward because there was a lack of communication, and they ring up and say, hey, can I have an AIN? And my only answer is really, no, I don't have anybody. And it just makes me as an after hours manager feel really bad that I cannot provide, because I have my hands tied. I can't send the patient back to the ED. They have to manage with it. Let's say they already have 2 AINs on the floor, or even if they don't, I really feel for the nurses in the hospitals, like what they have to deal with. And it's just how difficult it is, and I do support the workloads, but does it actually go anywhere? Look, you know, because me as an after hours manager, I don't have much. Yeah, I can only say, please put it in. But then I don't know, it never gets followed up. Like, has anything been done about it, you know, because I don't have the staff to give, and it's nothing new, you know. So how can we, and, you know, nursing are tired, they burnt out, they over it, and they ask for help. And my answer, not always, but recently pretty often, he says, I'm sorry, I can't help you. We have to just deal with it somehow. If we get the doctor or get the review the patient, but they all frustrated, you know. So that's what I'm just trying to speak for nurses, that even us as a management after hours, we're there for them, but we've got hands tied. That's it.
Dorothy, my advice too, and I hope you can hear me, I've actually diverted to my phone, I've ditched the computer. My advice to you is, as well as getting your staff to fill in a workload concern, I would suggest that you do as well, because this is actually a problem for you. And I can feel your pain, because I'm sure that many of the after hours nurse managers actually have a very similar situation going on, where there just is nobody else to give. And you're right, you can't send the patient back down to the emergency department. So my advice is that you escalate it as well, if you can. Certainly, I speak for the public system, but I do have contact with some of my private facility colleagues. They are actioned, they are reviewed, there is a record. So my advice is, keep putting them in, and don't think of them as a bad thing. Think of them as a positive.
Yeah, and I'd like to assure you, Dorothy, as well, that none of those workload forms disappear into the ether. They all get tabled at the NAMCF. At the Royal Brisbane, where I work, we have a workload meeting in every stream once a month that members come to as well. We discuss every single workload form, and the nursing director writes an action against them. So if it's an ongoing issue, we have an action plan. If it's a one-off thing, then, you know, I'm never concerned about a one-off. But if we get a pattern, there is always an action plan. So you may never get to hear about that. I'm trying in a couple of our areas, we are actually bringing our after-hours nurse managers into our workload concern meetings, and that's been really beneficial both for them and for us.
Yeah, okay, thank you. It's like, you know, when you need to provide meal relief in the middle of the night, but there isn't any.
Sometimes there is nothing you can do but report it, so that if it's a trend, if it happens one night, that's fine. But if this is a trend and you're having trouble every night, there needs to be a plan put in place about what are we going to do about this, because we've got a problem during the night.
Yeah, okay,
and the workload forms are the evidence that build that. So, Alanna...
Sorry, Kim. I think it's really important for duty nurse managers to understand that nobody is targeting them. No. Not one single nurse I work with expects that someone's going to pull a nurse special out of the air in the middle of the night. It's all just about protecting themselves professionally by documenting it somewhere that they asked for help and they couldn't get it.
Yeah, and sometimes a nurse can be pulled from a quiet area to do a special, you know, and you wouldn't even know that that person would be available unless you went through the after-hours nurse manager.
That's correct.
Yeah. And Alanna, there's a question here about what do you do when your NUM is not supportive of addressing long-term workload issues despite ongoing identification over several years?
My very strong advice then is, as I mentioned earlier, in nursing and midwifery, we have a very clear governance structure. You know, you have a nurse unit manager, you probably have a nursing director or assistant nursing director, you have a director of nursing, and ultimately in the public system, you have, you know, a position like mine. My strong advice is you escalate until you get the response that you need. Now, the response might be, we're aware and we're dealing with it. It might be, there's nothing we can do, but at least you get it acknowledged. And you've also got the QNMU. You know, the QNMU is our industrial body, and we do work with the QNMU. And Kim has often rung me and said, did you know? And I didn't know. And that's not because we've got bad nurse unit managers or anybody's trying to be, you know, people get busy, things happen. There's lots of reasons. So my very strong feeling is it doesn't matter where the escalation happens or who from. if there is a problem, then address it and go to that next level if you need to. That's what it's there for. If you're a registered nurse or a clinical nurse on the ward or the team leader, then and you don't get the response that you think that you deserve from the NUM, then you go to the nursing director or the assistant nursing director or the DON or the EDNMS or the QNMU. I think there are lots of ways. There's a million ways to skin a cat.
Kylie's asking, does filling a workload form in as a group of nurses have more influence than completing as an individual? Often it's difficult to get a collective to complete.
No, I don't think it matters whose name is on that workload concern form. You can be one person filling it in for the team. You can identify the other team members if they're happy to be identified. They're not happy to be identified, that's not a problem as well. I don't think it matters whether there's one name or 100 names. If it's a workload concern, it's a workload concern. And just because it's not everybody's concern doesn't mean it's not yours. You're just as professionally culpable and liable and have a responsibility to protect you and the organisation against any potential adverse effects to your patients or to you. The adverse effect may not be to the patient. You might bust your boiler to actually provide the appropriate care, but to what end? To your detriment? That's not fair either. So I think it's really important. It doesn't, having 50 names doesn't make it any more impactful than having one.
I have to say, though, sometimes we get multiple workload forms for the same shift. There is no need to do that. One person can do it on behalf of everybody.
Yeah.
You can all put them in if you choose to, but we will deal with them when we have our discussions with the nursing directors. We'll deal with them as the one shift issue. So there actually is no need to slam the NUM with 10 workload forms. You can just do one on behalf of the shift. And you will not get, sometimes there was a bit of an urban myth a while back that, if you popped your head up and you put your name on a workload form, you're going to be punished by roster or there will be repercussions. I have yet to see ever that happening. It's a bit of an urban myth that people believe there can be repercussions. I've never actually seen any evidence that there's any repercussions. And certainly in the public sector, workload reporting is very encouraged. And I know in Metro North it is very encouraged and welcomed. The other issue that's just come up here, Alanna, is the fact that they're getting resolved without a conversation. So without coming back to the person involved, they just get an email saying the issue's been resolved. I have an issue with this as well. I firmly believe the NUM needs to go back to that person and get permission to resolve it before they tick that resolve box.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you either. I think, and I think this is one of the failings of our current system. I think in the old days when we had the A, B and C form, which was a filing nightmare, but I think that it was easier to actually document and appropriately resolve it than it is now. But I agree. I think that the person who completes the workload concern form should have a conversation again with the NUM to say, look, this is what we've done. I would really like to resolve this and, get it off my plate. Are you comfortable that we've resolved that particular issue? That's not to say the same issue won't come up again. It may. We hope that it doesn't, but they do. That goes without saying. So my strong advice is that if you're a NUM, that you do go back to your staff and just say, look, got your workload concern form. This is what we've done. It was discussed at the NMCF. The nursing director has been back to me, told me it's been discussed. I'd like to resolve it. Are you comfortable? It's as easy as that. And if they say yes, that's great. And if they say no, the conversation then goes, well, what would it take for you to think that we had resolved the issue? And then you can discuss what strategies you want to put in place to, mitigate the risk, to alleviate. The other thing I just wanted to mention, it was something that was said earlier, one of the things that workload concern forms actually do, and most of you, certainly in the public sector, will be well aware of risk registers. We use workload concern forms to put on the risk register, not individual concerns, but if we see that there's a consistent risk being, or a consistent theme coming through, then it will often inform a risk. Now, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I have in the past absolutely used the trends in workload concern forms to say there is a risk and this is what we're going to do to mitigate it. So, and whether or not that be there's a risk of us going to the commission, there is a risk of, it can be a million things, but please, they are really important.
I think it was when you were out, Alanna, someone from CSD put a question about when you're not frontline and you're not doing direct care. And I was saying it doesn't matter what you're doing as a nurse or midwife or AIN. If you've got a workload issue, absolutely. Even if it's equipment, if you've got a sterilizer that's been broken down for 3 months and it's putting pressure on the service, that absolutely, put a workload form in, doesn't get fixed, put another workload form in. And also in response to the issue around it being resolved, you can always send an email back to your line manager to say, no, I do not agree that this is resolved. You can always CC in your union organiser, and most NUMs and managers are quite used that that's not a uncomfortable thing. You shouldn't feel uncomfortable about doing that. Because we're involved in the discussions anyway with all the workload forms. So particularly if it's, if it's a one-off, perhaps just have a conversation. But if you're finding you're putting regular workload forms in, they're coming back as resolved and you don't think they are resolved, escalate that. Send an email back, talk to your QNMU organiser and say, no, this is not resolved. This is an ongoing issue. And that's when it goes into the grievance process.
Absolutely. The other thing I would suggest too, though, if you are saying it's not resolved and you have an idea on how it could be, please help your nurse unit manager. They've, as I said, I think the NUM role is a really hard role sometimes. So if you can help them to help resolve it, you might work consistently night duties and afternoon shifts and see something that they can't see. And sometimes it's hard to see the wood for the trees. So if you've got an idea, put your idea forward. It mightn't get adopted in its entirety. It might get adopted in part. Other team members might think it's useful. So give them your ideas if you've got some.
Because it's not always staff that you need, is it, Alanna? And it's not even always equipment. Sometimes it's skill. And one thing that's popped up recently is scope of practice. Sometimes if we were able to work to our complete scope of practice, a lot of our workload issues would reduce, particularly around discharging, ENs doing IV meds, criteria-led discharge, things like that. If we allowed people to work to their scope and not have to rely on other professionals sometimes, because they often hold up, particularly discharging, sometimes the answer lies somewhere totally different than actual staffing.
Absolutely. And certainly one of the things that the Dons and I have been discussing in Metro North of late, and I know it's been quite topical in the EDON forum, which is all of the statewide public sector Dons, is actually getting nurses to be able to work to top of scope. And that's regardless of their level, because even an AIN, well, an AIN doesn't have a scope, but an undergraduate student in nursing has a scope, an enrolled nurse has a scope, registered nurses, nurse practitioners. We have got so much opportunity. And in reality, post-COVID, I know we're tired. I get that. I feel your pain. I've experienced it as well. But we really need to start thinking about the opportunities that COVID has actually afforded us. And one of them is actually using nurses to their full scope of practice and working together to achieve that. It's not going to happen overnight. We do need to work on it. But, I can speak for my own HHS. I don't think we've used our enrolled nursing workforce to the best of their ability. I think there's lots of work we can do in that space. We have really, I and the other Dons hadn't really thought too much, to be honest, about undergraduate students in nursing. But we've really, COVID taught us that, we have been doing some amazing stuff. We've actually got them as part of our workforce now. We're using them more and more. Probably not quite where I want them to be. If I leave anything behind when I retire, it's that I've got some parts of our professions working to top of scope. But I do think we've got opportunity. And the other thing is, one of the things I've been asked for is what is the quantum of nurse practitioners that we need? And I think that's really exciting for nursing. For the first time in a long time, people are actually asking our profession what we need. It's the way it should have always been, but I think COVID has actually put us front and centre. And, you know, to each and every one of you, regardless of whether you're in the public or private sector, I take my hat off to you. We all worked so hard for the last 33 months. And yes, it's been tough. And yes, we've, you know, fought a long road and we've got a long way to go. But keep up the great work. Keep your head held high. You did amazing things. I think Queensland, no, we didn't do it as long as Victoria, but trust me, we did just as tough. You know, they were in lockdown a lot longer, but that doesn't mean our nurses and midwives didn't work just as hard as the Victorian nurses and midwives. And I do say that to my Victorian colleagues all the time. Yeah, you did it longer, but you didn't do it any tougher. So thank you to each and every one of you, you know, and I think I would speak from every executive director of nursing, public or private. You know, we know what you've been through. We lived it with you, maybe not, you know, at the front line, but we were behind the scenes trying to do what we could, and we will continue to do that. I don't think that we should ever stop.
Thank you, Alanna. Just Rebecca's put a very pertinent comment in there about don't forget the role of HSRs for helping resolving problems. And HSRs absolutely can get involved in the workload process as well if it's unsafe. So absolutely. And I think particularly in the private sector where you don't have such a robust system, I think it's a really good, someone's saying what's a HSR, health and safety rep. So as a health and safety rep, you have certain powers under legislation where you can address issues around safety in the workplace.
But don't forget too, and I don't disagree with that comment, so please don't take this as disagreeing, but nursing has a really robust workload concern framework, and I'd strongly encourage you to use it. You know, we've worked on it for a very long time, and I think that forgetting how you enter it into a system that's one thing, but the actual process, it's really robust and it does work.
Yeah, I think the issue, Alanna, is maybe more in the private sector and the aged care sector where they don't have that great, we have a really good system that works pretty well. But sometimes you need to think outside the box when you're in a situation where you don't have such a good process in place.
Yeah.
Well, we've hit the 7 o'clock mark. Is there any other questions? I noticed there's a couple of points around NUMS not welcoming and encouraging the workload forms. You know, I think you have to just keep at it. You have to lodge them. It's a professional responsibility. It's actually part of your code of conduct. It's also actually part of Queensland Health's own policies to say that you will report workloads. So I think the more you put them in, I find NUMS usually come around once they see the benefit that they actually will get from it, because it gives them a lot more power when they're trying to go, no NUM wants you to work short, particularly ongoing. If they will know if they don't have enough staff and they need to fight to get better ratios, and the best evidence they can use, or one of the best evidence they can use, is a series of workload forms over 12 months is really powerful when they go and talk to their finance people. Don't
forget, clinical standards are everyone's responsibility.
Absolutely.
Yours at the bedside and mine as the chief nurse. It is absolutely imperative that we do what we can to make sure that our patients are safe and our staff are safe. I need to protect your registration just as much as you need to protect mine. We need to work together to make sure that we give the best possible care to our patients in the safest possible way, and we look after each other.
That's fabulous. We've got some really positive feedback there in the chat, Alanna, saying it was very informative and excellent presentation. So we'd like to thank you very much for taking the time speaking with us today.
No problems. And as I said, if anybody wants to make contact with me, I'd be very happy to chat. And from a BPF perspective, you may or may not know that Metro North is actually developing the electronic BPF tool which should make everyone's life a little bit easier. And for those of you who are at the bedside who say that, and I take on board that it probably isn't ready yet to go out to the private sector, but that, there's no reason why as we develop it more robustly that we can't. What I would strongly recommend, though, we're happy to chat to you anytime about the BPF, but when the BPF does become an electronic version and everyone has access to it, certainly Metro North, those that are on from Metro North will understand what I'm talking about. It will be so much easier than trying to look for a piece of paper hanging on a wall with your notional ratios. You'll just be able to bring it up on your computer and add and delete and take things away and do all those sorts of things.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alanna. We've appreciated that.
Thank you.
And anyone, if you've got any questions or concerns that you'd like QNMU to look at, I'm happy for you to come through me, kim.ramsdale@qnmu.org.au, and I'll pass you on to your organiser. So thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. That was great.
Thank you.